The warden's pen stopped mid-signature on the execution order, her weathered hand trembling as she looked up at the condemned man's final request. Thomas Mitchell sat motionless in his death row cell, gray eyes fixed on the clock showing 6 hours and 30 minutes until his lethal injection, when he spoke the words that would change everything. "I want to see my dog one last time." The guard's coffee cup crashed to the concrete floor, the metallic clang echoing through the sterile corridor as other inmates pressed their faces against cell bars, sensing something unprecedented unfolding. Warden Eleanor Hartwell had overseen 43 executions in her 20-year career, but never had a dying man's last wish involved a 9-year-old German shepherd with graying fur and amber eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Outside the Riverside County Correctional Facility, Sarah Patterson clutched Max's leash with white knuckles, the loyal dog whining softly as if he sensed his master's approaching fate. The morning mist clung to the prison walls like a shroud, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled 6 times. What truth had Max been guarding for 3 long years? And why did a man facing death believe his dog held the key to everything? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Thomas Mitchell had once stood tall among Riverside's finest, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of justice for 35 years as police chief. Now, at 68, those same shoulders slumped beneath the orange fabric of death row, his weathered face telling the story of a man who had watched his world crumble one piece at a time. The lines around his steel-gray eyes spoke of sleepless nights and faded hope, yet there remained an undeniable dignity in his bearing that even prison couldn't erase. Before the nightmare began, Tom had been Riverside's moral compass, a Vietnam veteran who'd returned home with a Purple Heart and an unwavering belief in right and wrong. His modest ranch house on Maple Street had been filled with the laughter of neighborhood children who sought his wisdom, and the gentle presence of Max, the German shepherd who'd become his shadow after retiring from K-9 duty. Max wasn't just any dog, 9 years old now with distinctive amber eyes that seemed to understand human speech. He bore the scars of service and the wisdom of a creature who'd seen both the best and worst of humanity. Sarah Patterson, Tom's 65-year-old sister-in-law, had become Max's reluctant guardian when Tom's world collapsed 3 years ago. A retired elementary school principal with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, Sarah possessed the quiet strength of someone who'd spent decades nurturing young minds. Childless by circumstance rather than choice, she'd poured her maternal instincts into caring for her late sister's husband and his faithful companion. The financial burden of Tom's legal fees had drained her teacher's pension, forcing her to take part-time work at the local library just to afford Max's arthritis medication. Detective Robert Bobby Kane represented everything Tom had once hoped to achieve through mentorship. At 45, Bobby cut an impressive figure as Riverside's current police chief, his dark hair showing premature silver at the temples and his brown eyes carrying what most interpreted as the weight of difficult decisions. What the community didn't know was that Bobby had been Tom's foster son, taken in at age 12 after his parents died in what was officially ruled a car accident. Tom had raised Bobby with firm discipline and unwavering moral standards, believing that structure and accountability would help the traumatized boy build a meaningful life. The town of Riverside itself had become a character in this tragedy, a community of 30,000 souls nestled in California's inland valleys, where everyone knew their neighbor's business, and the local diner served as an unofficial courthouse for public opinion. The recent closure of the textile factory had left many families struggling, creating an atmosphere where people needed someone to blame for their troubles. Tom's fall from grace had provided that target, dividing longtime friends and neighbors into bitter camps of believers and doubters. Marcus Rivera's murder had shattered this tight-knit community's sense of security. The respected warehouse supervisor had been found shot with Tom's service weapon, apparently killed to prevent his testimony in a corruption case. The evidence seemed overwhelming: fingerprints, motive, opportunity. Yet those who knew Tom best couldn't reconcile the gentle man who'd rescued stray animals with the cold-blooded killer described in court. Warden Eleanor Hartwell had overseen more final requests than she cared to remember, but nothing had prepared her for the quiet desperation in Tom Mitchell's voice. "A dog?" she repeated, her weathered face creasing with confusion. "Mr. Mitchell, you understand that's highly irregular. We have protocols." "Ma'am, with all due respect," Tom interrupted, his voice carrying the same steady authority that had once commanded a police force, "that dog has been more loyal to me than most people. If I'm going to die today, I'd like to say goodbye to the one soul who never doubted my innocence." Something in his tone made Hartwell pause. In 20 years of corrections work, she'd developed an instinct for reading condemned men. Some raged, others wept. Many simply withdrew into themselves. But Tom Mitchell sat with the quiet dignity of a man who'd made peace with an unjust fate, asking only for a moment with his companion. Against her better judgment, she found herself reaching for the phone. Sarah Patterson's hands trembled as she answered the call. Max's warm weight pressed against her legs in the small kitchen of her modest apartment. The dog had been restless all morning, pacing between the front door and the window overlooking the parking lot, as if sensing the significance of this terrible day. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Warden Hartwell from the correctional facility. Your brother-in-law has made a final request to see his dog. I realize this is unusual, but given the circumstances—" The warden's voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken weight of finality hanging in the air. Sarah's throat constricted. She looked down at Max, whose amber eyes seemed to hold an almost human understanding of the conversation. The German shepherd had aged visibly in the 3 years since Tom's arrest. His once glossy coat now dull with grief, his powerful frame diminished by poor appetite and sleepless nights spent waiting by the door. "We'll be there in an hour," Sarah whispered, already reaching for Max's leash with her free hand. The drive to the correctional facility passed in a blur of spring countryside, cherry blossoms lining the highway like nature's own funeral arrangement. Max sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, his scarred muzzle pressed against the window, nostrils working overtime as familiar scents grew stronger. Sarah found herself talking to him, her voice breaking as she tried to prepare him for what might be their final goodbye to the man who'd saved them both. "He loves you so much, boy," she murmured, one hand briefly leaving the steering wheel to stroke his graying fur. "You've been such a good dog, such a faithful friend. Whatever happens today, remember that you made his life better." The prison's imposing concrete walls rose before them like a monument to human failing. Sarah had made this drive dozens of times for visitation, but today felt different, heavier, more final. The weight of 3 years of fighting an unjust system, of watching a good man's reputation destroyed by circumstantial evidence, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Security procedures that had become routine now felt surreal. Max, usually calm during their visits, exhibited unusual anxiety as they passed through the metal detectors and checkpoints. His ears remained perpetually pricked forward, his nose working constantly, and Sarah noticed his hackles rising slightly as they approached the visitation area. "He knows," she thought to herself. "Dogs always know." The visiting room had been cleared for this unprecedented meeting. Tom sat at the standard metal table, his hands folded calmly despite the shackles around his wrists. 3 years of incarceration had aged him significantly, his dark hair now completely silver, his face gaunt from prison food and the stress of fighting for his life through an appeals process that had ultimately failed him. When the door opened and Max entered, time seemed to suspend itself. The dog froze mid-step, his entire body going rigid as his eyes locked onto Tom's face. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, man and dog simply stared at each other across 3 years of forced separation. Then Max let out a sound Sarah had never heard before, something between a whine and a cry that seemed to pour from his very soul. He lunged forward with such force that Sarah had to release the leash, and suddenly 60 pounds of pure loyalty was across the room, throwing himself against Tom's chest with desperate intensity. Tom's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he buried his face in Max's neck, his shackled hands clutching at the dog's fur as if afraid he might disappear. Max whined and pawed at Tom's orange jumpsuit, his tail beating a frantic rhythm against the concrete floor, every fiber of his being radiating joy at this unexpected reunion. "Hey there, good boy," Tom whispered, his voice breaking. "Hey there, my faithful friend. I missed you so much." But then something extraordinary happened. Max suddenly grew still, pressing his nose against Tom's prison uniform pocket with intense focus. He began pawing at the fabric with increasing urgency, whining in a pitch Sarah had never heard before, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of desperate communication. "What's he doing?" Warden Hartwell asked, her brow furrowing as she watched Max's increasingly agitated behavior. The German shepherd was pawing frantically at Tom's pocket, his whines growing more urgent by the second. Tom looked down in confusion, reaching into his pocket with his shackled hands. "There's nothing here but—" He paused, pulling out a small piece of fabric. "Just a scrap from my old uniform. They let me keep it when I was sentenced." Max's reaction was immediate and startling. The moment the fabric appeared, he began trembling violently, his amber eyes fixed on the small piece of cloth with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. His whines escalated to short, sharp barks, and he began pawing at Tom's chest as if trying to communicate something desperately important. "I've never seen him act like this," Sarah whispered, moving closer to the table. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" Before anyone could react, Max suddenly stiffened, his eyes rolling back. His powerful legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the cold concrete floor, his body convulsing as foam appeared at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, God, no!" Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees beside the seizing dog. "Max! Someone help him!" Tom fought against his restraints, the metal cutting into his wrists as he tried to reach his companion. "Please get these off me! Let me help him!" Prison medical staff rushed into the room, but their expertise lay with human emergencies, not veterinary crises. Max's breathing was labored, his heartbeat irregular and weak. The prison doctor, a gray-haired man named Stevens, knelt beside the dog and shook his head grimly. "He needs immediate veterinary care," Dr. Stevens announced. "This appears to be a massive cardiac episode." "I'd estimate he has minutes, not hours." "The nearest animal hospital is Riverside Emergency Veterinary Clinic," Sarah said through her tears. "Dr. Emily Rodriguez. She's been treating Max's arthritis. She knows his condition." Warden Hartwell faced an unprecedented decision. In her 20 years of prison administration, she'd never dealt with a situation like this. Protocol demanded that the execution proceed on schedule, that Tom remain in custody until his final moment. But looking at the broken man in shackles, watching his beloved companion dying on the floor, something in her weathered heart shifted. "Against every regulation I've sworn to uphold," she said quietly, "I'm authorizing emergency transport to the veterinary hospital. Mr. Mitchell, you'll remain in full custody and restraints, but you may accompany your dog." The convoy that raced through Riverside streets was unlike anything the small city had ever seen. An ambulance carrying Max in critical condition, followed by a police transport vehicle with Tom shackled in the back seat, and finally a parade of media vans that had somehow learned of the unusual circumstances. At Riverside Emergency Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Emily Rodriguez was waiting. A compassionate woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and steady hands, she had been Max's primary veterinarian for years and had always suspected there was more to Tom's case than the evidence suggested. "Get him into surgery immediately," she ordered as Max was wheeled in on a gurney. "I need to stabilize his heart rhythm before we lose him." Tom, still in shackles but allowed to stay near the operating room, watched through the observation window as Dr. Rodriguez worked frantically to save Max's life. Sarah stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them silently praying for a miracle they weren't sure they deserved. "His heart is severely stressed," Dr. Rodriguez explained during a brief break in the surgery. "But there's something else. I'm detecting a foreign object in his stomach area, something that's been there for quite some time, possibly years. It may be contributing to his distress." "A foreign object?" Tom asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Dogs sometimes swallow things they shouldn't," the veterinarian explained. "But given Max's training and discipline, it would have to be something he felt compelled to take and hide. The X-rays show it's metallic, roughly the size of a large coin or small jewelry." Sarah gasped, her eyes widening with sudden understanding. "Tom, remember that night 3 years ago? The night Marcus Rivera was killed? Max was acting so strange when you came home. He kept trying to get something from your jacket, and then he suddenly ran outside." Tom's face went pale as the memory surfaced. "He came back about an hour later, seemed agitated. We thought he'd just been chasing rabbits or investigating neighborhood sounds." Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances with the prison guards who were maintaining custody. "I need to remove this object as part of the surgery anyway. It's causing internal irritation that's contributing to his cardiac stress. But given the timeline you're describing, this might be something the authorities should examine." Detective Marcus Rodriguez, no relation to the veterinarian, arrived at the clinic within 30 minutes of being called. A 28-year veteran of the Riverside Police Department, he had been one of the junior officers who assisted in building the case against Tom. He'd always harbored private doubts about certain aspects of the evidence, but career considerations had kept him silent. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said formally, "I understand you've discovered potential evidence in the dog's stomach." "I have to warn you," the veterinarian replied. "Removing it is the only way to save the dog's life. But the object appears to have been there for approximately 3 years, based on the tissue formation around it. If this is connected to the Rivera case..." Detective Rodriguez looked at Tom through the observation window. The condemned man sat motionless, his eyes never leaving Max's unconscious form on the operating table. 3 hours until execution, and suddenly everything might be about to change. "Proceed with the surgery," Rodriguez decided. "But I'm calling this in as potential new evidence. We need to follow proper chain of custody procedures." As Dr. Rodriguez carefully extracted the foreign object from Max's stomach, the small metallic item caught the surgical lights. It was a cufflink, an expensive one, with distinctive engravings that Detective Rodriguez immediately recognized. Marcus Rivera had been wearing cufflinks the night he died. But according to the crime scene report, both cufflinks had been found with the body. This third cufflink had never been cataloged, never been entered into evidence. Max had been carrying the truth in his body for 3 years, and now, with only hours before Tom's execution, that truth was finally coming to light. Detective Marcus Rodriguez stared at the cufflink under the harsh fluorescent lights of the veterinary clinic, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the evidence bag. 28 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that he'd helped convict an innocent man. "This changes everything," he muttered, pulling out his cell phone. "I need to call the DA's office immediately." "Wait," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She had been silent during the surgery, but now her eyes blazed with 3 years of suppressed fury and determination. "Before you make that call, Detective Rodriguez, there's something you need to see." From her worn leather purse, Sarah extracted a thick manila folder, its edges frayed from countless hours of handling. "I've been investigating this case myself for 3 years. Every lead you ignored, every witness you never interviewed, every piece of evidence that somehow got overlooked." Detective Rodriguez's face flushed red. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but you can't just—" "Can't what?" Sarah's voice rose, years of frustration finally erupting. "Can't try to save an innocent man's life while you all sat on your hands? Can't do the job you should have done 3 years ago?" She opened the folder with deliberate precision, spreading photographs, bank records, and witness statements across the clinic's reception desk. Marcus Rivera wasn't just a warehouse supervisor detective. He was investigating a drug money laundering operation that involved members of your own police department. Tom looked up from his vigil beside Max's recovery kennel, his eyes widening as he processed Sarah's words. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the truth that nobody wanted to hear," she replied, her voice breaking with emotion. Rivera had been documenting evidence for months. He knew about officers skimming money from drug seizures, about evidence disappearing from lockup, about cases being fixed. Detective Rodriguez examined the documents with growing alarm. Sarah had assembled a comprehensive timeline that painted a picture of systematic corruption within the Riverside Police Department. Bank records showing unusual deposits, photographs of officers meeting with known drug dealers, witness statements describing payoffs and evidence tampering. "How did you get all this?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "By doing what you should have done," Sarah shot back. "By talking to Rivera's girlfriend, Maria Santos, who you never bothered to interview. By visiting the warehouse workers who saw strange meetings in Rivera's office. By following the money trail that led straight back to the police department." She pulled out a photograph that made Rodriguez's blood run cold. It showed Police Chief Bobby Kane entering a known drug house on the east side of town, the timestamp clearly visible, 2 weeks before Rivera's murder. "Bobby Kane," Tom whispered, his face draining of color. "My Bobby." Sarah's expression softened as she looked at her brother-in-law. "Tom, I know this is hard to hear, but Bobby has been living a double life for years. The gambling debts, the pressure, the fear of disappointing you. It all led him down a dark path." The folder contained more devastating evidence. Recordings of phone conversations between Bobby and drug dealers, financial records showing Bobby's mounting gambling debts, and most damning of all, a witness statement from a security guard who saw Bobby leaving the warehouse the night Rivera was murdered. "Maria Santos saw Rivera talking to someone on the phone the night he died," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "He was scared. Said he was meeting with the kid to give him one last chance to come clean before going to the authorities." Detective Rodriguez felt his world crumbling around him. Bobby Kane had been his partner when they were both junior officers. He'd watched Bobby rise through the ranks, had celebrated his promotion to chief, had worked closely with him to build the case against Tom Mitchell. The evidence against Tom was too perfect, Rodriguez admitted, his voice hollow with realization. The fingerprints on the gun, the motive, the timeline, it all fell into place too neatly. "Because Bobby made it fall into place," Sarah said. "He had access to Tom's service weapon through the evidence locker. He knew Tom's schedule, his habits, his weaknesses, and most importantly, he knew that Tom would never suspect his own foster son." Dr. Emily Rodriguez emerged from the surgical suite, her scrubs stained with blood but her expression cautiously optimistic. "Max is stable for now," she announced. "The surgery was successful, and removing that foreign object seems to have relieved a significant amount of internal pressure. He's not out of the woods yet, but he's fighting." Tom closed his eyes in relief, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude. But even as joy flooded through him at Max's survival, the weight of Bobby's betrayal pressed down on his chest like a physical burden. "There's more," Sarah said quietly, opening another section of her folder. Bobby didn't act alone. The corruption goes deeper than just skimming drug money. She revealed evidence of a protection racket that had been operating in Riverside for years. Drug dealers paid police officers for advance warning of raids. Evidence mysteriously disappeared from lockup, and witnesses were intimidated into silence. Rivera had stumbled onto the operation while investigating discrepancies in warehouse inventory. Drugs that should have been destroyed after seizure were somehow finding their way back onto the streets. Rivera was building a federal case, Sarah explained. He had contact information for FBI agents in Los Angeles. But before he could turn over his evidence, Bobby panicked and killed him. Detective Rodriguez's phone rang, startling everyone in the room. The caller ID showed Police Chief Bobby Kane's number. "Answer it," Sarah urged. "But put it on speaker. Let's hear what he has to say." Rodriguez accepted the call, his hand shaking as he activated the speaker function. "Marcus, where the hell are you?" Bobby's voice crackled through the phone, agitation clear in his tone. "The media is reporting that Tom Mitchell is at some veterinary clinic with his dog. What's going on?" "The dog collapsed during his final visit with Tom," Rodriguez replied carefully. "We had to rush him to emergency surgery. For Christ's sake, Marcus, we have an execution scheduled in 2 hours. This is not the time for sentimental animal rescue stories. Get Tom back to the facility immediately." Sarah gestured frantically, pointing to the evidence spread across the desk. Rodriguez took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would irrevocably change everything. "Bobby, we found something during the surgery. A piece of evidence that was never cataloged in the Rivera case." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several long seconds. "What kind of evidence?" Bobby's voice had changed, become carefully controlled. "A cufflink. One that doesn't match the pair found with Rivera's body." Another pause, longer this time. "Could be from anyone," Bobby said finally. "Probably been in the dog's stomach for years." "You know how dogs are. They eat anything." "The thing is, Bobby," Rodriguez continued, his voice gaining strength, "we've also been reviewing some additional evidence that wasn't fully explored during the original investigation." "What additional evidence?" Now Bobby's voice carried a sharp edge of panic. Sarah nodded encouragingly as Rodriguez continued. "Witness statements that were never followed up. Financial records that weren't examined. Security footage that somehow got overlooked." "Marcus, what the hell are you talking about? The case against Tom Mitchell was solid. We did our job." "Did we, Bobby? Or did we do exactly what someone wanted us to do?" The line went dead. Within minutes, Rodriguez's phone was buzzing with calls from the district attorney's office, the governor's legal team, and reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the developing story. The scheduled execution time was now less than 90 minutes away, and suddenly, everything was in chaos. Tom sat beside Max's kennel, gently stroking the sedated dog's fur through the wire bars. The German Shepherd was breathing steadily, his heart monitor showing a stable rhythm for the first time in hours. "I'm sorry, boy," Tom whispered. "I'm sorry you had to carry this burden for so long. You were trying to tell us the truth all along, weren't you?" Sarah approached her brother-in-law, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Tom, there's something else you need to know. About Bobby's childhood, about why he became so desperate to please you." She revealed the darkest secret of all. Bobby's parents hadn't died in a car accident as everyone believed. His father had been a corrupt police officer who committed suicide rather than face prosecution, and his mother had overdosed on pills 3 months later, unable to cope with the shame and disgrace. Bobby lived in terror of becoming his father, Sarah explained. When the gambling debts mounted and the corruption started, he saw history repeating itself. He killed Rivera not just to protect himself, but because he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing you the way his father had disappointed his family. Tom's eyes filled with tears as the full tragedy of the situation became clear. The boy he'd raised, the son he'd loved and mentored, had become everything Tom had tried to save him from. And in trying to hide his shame, Bobby had destroyed the very person whose approval he'd sought most. Dr. Rodriguez returned with Max's latest test results. "He's responding well to treatment," she reported. "But I have to warn you, the stress of carrying that foreign object for 3 years, combined with his age and pre-existing heart condition, means his recovery will be touch and go." Outside the clinic, news vans were gathering as word of the dramatic developments spread throughout Riverside and beyond. The scheduled execution of Tom Mitchell had become a media sensation, with questions swirling about police corruption, wrongful conviction, and the loyalty of a dog who had literally carried the truth in his body for 3 years. As the 90-minute mark approached, Detective Rodriguez made the most important decision of his career. He called the governor's office directly, bypassing the chain of command that had failed so spectacularly 3 years ago. "Governor Henderson, this is Detective Marcus Rodriguez from Riverside PD. I need to speak with you urgently about the Tom Mitchell execution. We have new evidence that suggests he's innocent, and we believe we know who the real killer is." Governor Patricia Henderson's voice crackled through the secure phone line, her tone sharp with urgency. "Detective Rodriguez, I have exactly 47 minutes before Tom Mitchell is scheduled to die. You better have ironclad evidence to support what you're telling me." Rodriguez glanced around the veterinary clinic, where the most unlikely collection of people had gathered to fight for justice. A condemned man in shackles, his sister-in-law turned amateur detective, a veterinarian who'd become an unwitting forensic expert, and a loyal dog whose body had preserved the truth for 3 years. "Governor, I've got documentary evidence of police corruption, witness statements that were never investigated, and physical evidence that was literally hidden inside the victim's dog," Rodriguez said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Tom Mitchell is innocent, and I believe his foster son, current Police Chief Bobby Kane, is the real killer." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. In the background, Rodriguez could hear urgent conversations and the rustling of papers. "I'm granting an emergency stay of execution," Governor Henderson announced. 2 hours to present your evidence to a panel of state investigators. But, Detective, if this turns out to be a desperate attempt to save a guilty man, there will be consequences for everyone involved." As Rodriguez ended the call, the veterinary clinic erupted in a mixture of relief and terror. Tom's execution had been postponed, but now they had less than 2 hours to convince skeptical investigators that 3 years of accepted truth had been built on lies and corruption. "We need to move fast," Sarah said, already organizing her evidence folders. "Bobby knows we're onto him. He'll try to destroy whatever evidence he can get his hands on." As if summoned by her words, the clinic's front door burst open. Police Chief Bobby Kane strode in, his usually immaculate uniform wrinkled and his face flushed with anger and desperation. Behind him came 2 patrol officers, their hands resting nervously on their service weapons. "This has gone far enough," Bobby announced, his voice carrying the authority of command but trembling with barely controlled emotion. "Detective Rodriguez, you're interfering with a lawful execution. Tom Mitchell was convicted by a jury of his peers, and no amount of last-minute theatrics is going to change that." Tom looked up from beside Max's kennel, his heart breaking as he saw the man he'd raised standing before him as an enemy. Bobby had aged in the 3 years since Tom's conviction, his dark hair now streaked with premature gray, his brown eyes haunted by secrets that had clearly been eating away at his soul. "Bobby," Tom said quietly, his voice filled with paternal love despite everything. Son, just tell the truth. Whatever you've done, whatever pressure you've been under, we can work through it together. Bobby's facade cracked for just a moment, pain flashing across his features before he hardened his expression again. Don't call me son. You lost that right when you taught me that being honest would always be enough, that doing the right thing would always be rewarded. Where did your precious honesty get you, Tom? Sitting on death row for a crime you didn't commit. But you know I didn't commit it, Tom replied, standing slowly despite his shackles. You know because you were there that night. You were the one Rivera was meeting. Sarah stepped forward, her evidence folder clutched against her chest like a shield. Bobby, I know about the gambling debts. I know about the protection money, the missing evidence, the drugs that disappeared from lockup. Rivera found out, didn't he? He gave you a chance to come clean before going to the FBI. Bobby's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. You're talking nonsense. Rivera was killed by Tom during a confrontation about the corruption case. The evidence was clear. The evidence was manufactured, Detective Rodriguez interjected, moving to stand beside Sarah. The fingerprints on the gun, the convenient timeline, the witness statements that led nowhere, it was all too perfect, Bobby, too neat and tidy for a crime of passion. Dr. Emily Rodriguez emerged from the back room carrying a sealed evidence bag containing the cufflink that had been removed from Max's stomach. This cufflink bears the same distinctive engravings as the pair found with Rivera's body, she announced. But it also has something else, trace amounts of blood that don't match Rivera's type. Bobby's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but the patrol officers behind him exchanged uncertain glances. They'd come expecting to assist their chief in a routine matter, but the evidence being presented was painting a very different picture. You can't prove anything with that, Bobby said, his voice rising in pitch. That dog could have picked up that cufflink anywhere, anytime. Actually, we can prove quite a bit, Sarah replied, opening her folder and extracting a series of photographs. These pictures show you entering the warehouse district on the night Rivera was murdered. The timestamps are clear, Bobby. You were there. She spread the photos across the reception desk, each one more damning than the last. Bobby entering Rivera's warehouse office, Bobby leaving in an obvious hurry 40 minutes later, Bobby stopping at a 24-hour convenience store with what appeared to be blood on his shirt sleeve. The convenience store clerk remembers you, Sarah continued relentlessly. You bought bleach and hydrogen peroxide at 11:30 p.m. Unusual purchases for someone who claimed to be home all evening. Tom watched his foster son's face crumble as the weight of evidence mounted against him. The boy he'd found broken and traumatized at age 12, the young man he'd mentored through police academy, the son he'd been so proud to see rise through the ranks, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies and corruption. You don't understand, Bobby said, his voice breaking. I never meant for any of this to happen. The gambling started small, just weekend poker games with the guys. But it escalated, and before I knew it, I owed people who don't accept excuses for payment. The truth began pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. The protection money from drug dealers had started as a way to pay off gambling debts. The missing evidence, the fixed cases, the corruption, it had all snowballed beyond his control. Rivera found out about the missing cocaine from the Henderson bust, Bobby continued, tears streaming down his face. 3 kilos that should have been destroyed but somehow ended up back on the streets. He had documentation, photographs, recorded conversations. He was going to destroy everything I'd worked for. So you killed him, Rodriguez stated flatly. I just wanted to scare him, Bobby shouted, his composure finally shattering completely. I took Tom's gun from the evidence locker, thinking if Rivera saw a weapon he'd back down, but he fought back, tried to get the gun away from me. It went off during the struggle. Tom closed his eyes, the full weight of betrayal settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The boy he'd saved, the son he'd loved, had not only committed murder but had allowed him to take the blame. "What about the dog?" Dr. Rodriguez asked quietly. "How did Max end up with Rivera's cufflink?" Bobby's face twisted with bitter irony. "The damn dog appeared out of nowhere during the struggle. Must have followed Tom's scent on me. When Rivera fell, his cufflinks scattered across the floor. The dog grabbed one before I could stop him and ran off into the night." "And you let me sit on death row for 3 years," Tom said, his voice hollow with grief. "You built a case against me, testified at my trial, looked me in the eye and swore you believed in my guilt." "I couldn't let you find out what I'd become," Bobby replied, his voice barely audible. "You were the only father I ever really had. I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in your eyes when you learned the truth about me." Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the emotional devastation like a knife. "So, instead, you decided to let him die for your crimes?" Bobby had no answer for that. He stood there, uniform wrinkled, face streaked with tears, the weight of 3 years of lies finally crushing down on him. The patrol officers who had accompanied Bobby were now looking at their chief with horror and disgust. One of them, Officer Jennifer Hayes, stepped forward and spoke directly to Detective Rodriguez. "Sir, I think we need to place Chief Kane under arrest." Rodriguez nodded grimly, reading Bobby his rights as the younger officers applied handcuffs to the man who had been their commander just minutes before. As Bobby was led away, he turned back to look at Tom one final time. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." Tom met his gaze with eyes full of pain, but also something unexpected, forgiveness. "I love you, son," he said quietly. "I always have, and I always will. But you need to face the consequences of your choices now." Outside the clinic, news crews were capturing every moment of the dramatic arrest. The execution that had been scheduled to take place in less than an hour had transformed into the biggest corruption scandal in Riverside's history. The hours that followed Bobby's arrest blurred together in a haze of legal proceedings, media frenzy, and devastating revelations. Tom sat in the veterinary clinic's conference room, his shackles finally removed by order of the state investigators who had arrived from Sacramento. Through the window, he could see Max lying motionless in his recovery kennel, the loyal dog's chest rising and falling with mechanical precision thanks to the machines keeping him alive. "Mr. Mitchell," said State Investigator Catherine Walsh, a stern woman with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, "based on the evidence presented and Chief Kane's confession, the state is prepared to issue a full exoneration. However, I need you to understand that this doesn't undo the damage that's been done." Tom nodded numbly, his eyes never leaving Max's still form. "What damage can compare to watching the person you love most die because of your failures?" Sarah reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Tom, Max is fighting. Dr. Rodriguez says his vital signs have stabilized." But even as she spoke the hopeful words, Dr. Emily Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, her expression grave. She pulled Sarah aside, speaking in hushed tones that nonetheless carried clearly in the small room. "The surgery was successful in removing the foreign object," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "But the stress on his cardiovascular system has been enormous. Combined with his age and the trauma of carrying that evidence for 3 years, I'm afraid Max is experiencing cascading organ failure." Sarah's face crumpled as the medical reality hit her. "How long does he have?" "Hours, possibly less. His heart is giving out, and there's nothing more we can do medically. I'm sorry." Tom overheard every word, and something inside him shattered completely. He had spent 3 years on death row, accepting his fate with the dignity of a man who believed in divine justice. He had forgiven Bobby even as the truth of his betrayal was revealed. But losing Max, the one soul who had never doubted his innocence, who had literally carried the proof of his exoneration in his body, felt like a cruelty beyond comprehension. "I want to be with him," Tom said, his voice breaking. "Please. He saved my life. I need to be there for his final moments." The state investigators exchanged glances before nodding their consent. Tom was led to Max's kennel, where he knelt beside the metal enclosure and reached through the bars to stroke his companion's graying fur. "Hey there. Good boy," Tom whispered, his tears falling onto Max's muzzle. "You did it, didn't you? You saved me, just like you saved that family from the house fire all those years ago. You're the best dog who ever lived." Max's amber eyes fluttered open at the sound of Tom's voice. Despite his weakness, his tail managed one small wag against the kennel floor. Meanwhile, the full scope of the corruption scandal was coming to light. Bobby's arrest had triggered a comprehensive investigation that revealed a web of police misconduct spanning nearly a decade. Evidence rooms had been systematically looted, drug money had been skimmed, and cases had been fixed to protect criminal enterprises. Detective Rodriguez found himself at the center of a media storm as reporters demanded to know how such widespread corruption had gone undetected. Standing before a bank of microphones outside the veterinary clinic, he faced the hardest questions of his career. "Detective Rodriguez," called out Channel 7's investigative reporter, "how does it feel to know that you helped convict an innocent man while the real killer was your own police chief?" Rodriguez's weathered face showed every one of his 56 years as he struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of his failure. "There are no excuses for what happened here. We failed Tom Mitchell, we failed Marcus Rivera's family, and we failed this community. The only thing I can do now is ensure that every case Chief Kane touched gets reinvestigated." Back inside the clinic, Tom continued his vigil beside Max's kennel. Sarah sat nearby, her eyes red from crying as she watched the man she'd fought so hard to save face yet another devastating loss. "It's not fair," she whispered. "You're finally free, but Max is dying because he carried my burden for 3 years, Tom finished, his voice heavy with guilt. "If I had been a better father to Bobby, if I had seen the signs of his problems earlier, none of this would have happened." Dr. Rodriguez approached with Max's latest test results, her expression grim. "His kidneys are shutting down now," she reported quietly. "The stress from the surgery, combined with his advanced age and heart condition, I don't think he'll last through the night." Tom pressed his face against the kennel bars, his hand gently stroking Max's ear. "You don't have to fight anymore, boy. You did your job. You kept the truth safe until the right moment. You can rest now." As if understanding his words, Max's labored breathing began to slow. His eyes, still alert despite his body's failure, remained fixed on Tom's face with the same unwavering loyalty they had shown for 9 years. The tragedy deepened when news arrived that Bobby had attempted suicide in his holding cell, using strips torn from his uniform shirt to fashion a noose. He had been discovered by guards just in time, but his desperate act served as a final punctuation mark on the devastation that his crimes had wrought. "He left a note," Officer Hayes reported to the investigators. "He says he can't live with what he's done, that he never meant for Tom to actually be executed. He thought the appeals process would find the truth eventually." Tom received this news with a mixture of heartbreak and anger that surprised him with its intensity. "He was willing to let me die rather than face the consequences of his actions," he said bitterly. "The boy I raised was supposed to be better than that." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Tom, you gave Bobby every opportunity to choose the right path. You can't blame yourself for the choices he made as an adult." But Tom's grief ran deeper than personal betrayal. Looking at Max's failing form, He saw the ultimate symbol of loyalty and innocence destroyed by human corruption and weakness. The dog had never asked for any of this burden, yet he had carried it faithfully until his body could bear no more. As the evening wore on, Max's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became increasingly shallow, and his heart rate grew irregular despite the medications being administered. Dr. Rodriguez prepared Tom for the inevitable, explaining that Max's organs were shutting down one by one. "There's something called broken heart syndrome," she explained gently. "It's a real medical condition where extreme emotional stress can cause heart failure. I believe Max has been suffering from this for the entire 3 years you've been separated." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. Max hadn't just been carrying evidence of his innocence, he had been literally dying of a broken heart from their forced separation. Outside the clinic, the community of Riverside was grappling with its own broken heart. The police department that had served them for decades was revealed to be corrupt to its core. The man they had condemned as a killer was innocent, while the leader they had trusted was a murderer. The certainties that had defined their small city were crumbling around them. Reverend Michael Sullivan from Tom's old church arrived at the clinic as night fell, offering comfort to the small group maintaining their vigil. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "God's justice comes through the most unexpected messengers. That dog lying there has served a higher purpose than any of us could have imagined." Tom nodded, unable to speak as he watched Max's increasingly labored breathing. The machines monitoring the dog's vital signs painted a grim picture: blood pressure dropping, heart rate becoming erratic, oxygen levels falling despite the supplemental air being provided. At 11:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours after the scheduled time of Tom's execution, Max drew his final breath. His amber eyes, which had held such intelligence and loyalty throughout his life, grew still as they remained fixed on Tom's face. His last earthly act was a gentle exhalation that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Tom broke down completely then, his sobs echoing through the quiet veterinary clinic as he grieved for the most faithful friend he had ever known. Max had saved his life, but the cost had been the dog's own existence, a sacrifice that seemed to embody both the best and worst of what love could demand. The silence that followed Max's death was broken only by the soft hum of medical equipment and Tom's quiet sobs. Dr. Emily Rodriguez moved with practiced compassion, gently removing the monitoring devices and preparing Max's body with the reverence reserved for a fallen hero. The German Shepherd looked peaceful in death, his scarred muzzle relaxed and his amber eyes finally closed after years of vigilant watching. "He's at peace now," Dr. Rodriguez said softly, placing a clean blanket over Max's still form. "He completed his mission. He saved you, Tom." But even as Tom grieved, Sarah was pacing the clinic's conference room with renewed determination. The evidence she had spent 3 years collecting was now validated, but there were still questions that demanded answers. Bobby's confession had revealed the immediate circumstances of Rivera's murder, but the deeper corruption network remained largely unexposed. "We can't let this end with Bobby," she declared to the assembled investigators. "He was part of something bigger. The drug money, the evidence tampering, the protection racket. It goes beyond one corrupt cop." State Investigator Walsh nodded grimly. "We're already seeing the scope of it. Chief Kane's arrest has triggered a federal investigation. The DEA and FBI are reviewing every case he touched in the past 5 years. Detective Rodriguez, who had been silent since Bobby's confession, finally spoke up. "I've been going through old case files," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "There are at least a dozen convictions that need to be re-examined. Missing evidence, witness intimidation, coerced confessions. The pattern goes back years." The revelation that Tom's case was not an isolated incident sent shockwaves through the legal community. Public Defender James Morrison, who had represented Tom during his original trial, arrived at the clinic near midnight with boxes of case files and a team of lawyers. "Mr. Mitchell," Morrison said, his usually confident demeanor shaken, "I need to apologize. I believe the prosecution's case was solid. I failed you as your attorney, and I failed the system that depends on vigorous defense of the accused." Tom looked up from his vigil beside Max's body, his eyes red with grief, but his voice steady. "Jim, you worked with the evidence you were given. None of us could have imagined that the police chief himself was manufacturing that evidence." But Morrison wasn't finished. "There's something else. Bobby Kane personally handled evidence submission in 7 other murder cases over the past 3 years. All of them resulted in convictions, and all of them had the same pattern: circumstantial evidence that seemed almost too perfect. The implications were staggering. If Bobby had been fabricating evidence in multiple cases, there could be innocent people serving life sentences or even on death row throughout California. The corruption scandal that had begun with Tom's near execution was expanding into a crisis that threatened the entire criminal justice system. As dawn broke over Riverside, the true scope of Bobby's crimes began to emerge. Federal agents had executed search warrants on his home, his office, and several safe deposit boxes registered under false names. What they found painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple police misconduct. FBI Special Agent Patricia Collins briefed the assembled investigators on their discoveries. "We found detailed records of payments from drug dealers, loan sharks, and other criminal enterprises," she reported. Chief Kane was operating what amounted to a criminal organization within the police department. The financial records revealed a network of corruption involving at least 6 other officers, 3 city council members, and 2 prosecutors from the district attorney's office. Drug evidence worth millions of dollars had been stolen and resold, while the proceeds were laundered through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. "The murder of Marcus Rivera wasn't an isolated incident," Agent Collins continued. "Rivera had uncovered the entire operation and was preparing to expose it to federal authorities. His death was intended to protect a criminal enterprise worth millions of dollars." Tom listened to these revelations with growing horror. The boy he had raised, the son he had loved and mentored, had not only betrayed him personally but had corrupted the very institution Tom had devoted his life to serving. The Riverside Police Department that Tom had led with integrity for over 3 decades had become a criminal organization under Bobby's leadership. Sarah, meanwhile, was coordinating with legal advocacy groups to ensure that other potential victims of Bobby's corruption received proper representation. The Innocence Project had already committed to reviewing every case involving evidence handled by Bobby, while civil rights organizations were demanding a complete federal takeover of the Riverside Police Department. "Tom," Sarah said, approaching him as he sat beside Max's covered form, "there are reporters outside wanting to speak with you. The whole country is following this story now." Tom shook his head wearily. "I'm not ready to talk to anyone yet. Max died because of what Bobby did. That's all I can think about right now." But the media attention was unavoidable. The story of the condemned man saved by his loyal dog had captured national imagination, while the revelation of widespread police corruption had ignited demands for criminal justice reform across the country. News vans lined the streets around the veterinary clinic, and helicopter news crews circled overhead. Dr. Rodriguez provided a brief statement to the press, explaining Max's heroic role in preserving the evidence that exonerated Tom. "This dog carried the truth in his body for 3 years," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He literally died to save an innocent man's life." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Flowers, cards, and donations began arriving at the veterinary clinic from across the country. A prominent animal rights organization announced plans to create the Max Mitchell Award for canine heroism, while a best-selling author offered to write Max's biography with proceeds going to wrongfully convicted defendants. But for Tom, the accolades and attention felt hollow without Max there to share them. As he sat in the clinic's quiet back room, holding Max's collar and breathing in the familiar scent of his faithful companion, Tom felt more alone than he had even during his darkest days on death row. It was Reverend Sullivan who finally drew Tom out of his grief-stricken isolation. The elderly pastor had driven through the night from his church in Los Angeles, where he had been attending a conference, as soon as he heard the news. "Tom," the Reverend said gently, settling into a chair beside his old friend, "I know you're hurting. Losing Max feels like losing the last pure thing in a world full of corruption and betrayal." Tom nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "But that dog's sacrifice wasn't in vain," Sullivan continued. "Max saved your life, yes, but he did something even more important. He revealed the truth that's going to save other innocent people. His loyalty and your love for him have exposed a web of corruption that might have continued for years." The Reverend's words began to penetrate Tom's grief. Over the next several hours, as federal agents continued their investigation and the full scope of Bobby's crimes became clear, Tom began to understand that Max's death had meaning beyond their personal relationship. The evidence Max had preserved in his body was just the beginning. Bobby's panicked confession had provided federal investigators with the keys to unraveling a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond Riverside. Dozens of cases were being reopened, corrupt officials were being arrested, and the entire criminal justice system in Riverside County was being overhauled. By the afternoon, Agent Collins had more disturbing news. "We've identified at least 3 other innocent people currently serving time for crimes committed by Chief Kane's criminal network," she reported. 2 are serving life sentences, and 1 is scheduled for execution next month. The revelation that Max's sacrifice would save multiple innocent lives provided Tom with his first moment of peace since his dog's death. Max had not just died to save Tom. He had died to expose a corruption that was destroying innocent lives throughout California. As evening approached, Tom made his first public statement since his exoneration. Standing outside the veterinary clinic where Max had died, surrounded by federal agents, lawyers, and journalists, Tom spoke with quiet dignity about the dog who had saved his life. "Max was the best of us," Tom said, his voice steady despite his grief. "He was loyal when humans betrayed trust. He was truthful when others lived in lies. He was brave when others chose cowardice. If his death helps save even one other innocent person from the injustice I faced, then his sacrifice will have meaning." The questions from reporters came fast and furious. How did he feel about Bobby's betrayal? Would he forgive the system that had nearly killed him? What would he do with his freedom? Tom answered each question with the measured thoughtfulness that had made him respected as police chief. Yes, he was heartbroken by Bobby's betrayal, but he still loved the broken young man he had raised. Yes, he was angry at the system's failures, but he believed in the possibility of reform and redemption. And yes, he planned to use his freedom to ensure that no other innocent person would suffer as he had. But it was his final statement that captured headlines across the country. "Max taught me that loyalty doesn't require perfection. Love doesn't demand success, and truth will always find a way to surface. If we can learn those lessons as a society, then maybe some good can come from this tragedy." As Tom spoke those words, Sarah was making arrangements for Max's burial. The German Shepherd would be laid to rest in Riverside's Pet Memorial Garden with a headstone reading simply, "Max Mitchell, hero, faithful friend, keeper of truth." The corruption scandal that Max's sacrifice had exposed was far from over, Federal investigations would continue for months, trials would drag on for years, and the complete scope of Bobby's criminal network might never be fully known. But the truth that Max had carried in his body for 3 years was finally free, and with it came the promise that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. 6 months after Max's death, Tom Mitchell stood in the morning sunlight of Riverside's pet memorial garden, fresh wildflowers in his weathered hands. The simple granite headstone bore Max's name and dates, along with the inscription that had become a rallying cry for criminal justice reform: "Truth will always find a way to surface." The transformation in Tom's life had been as dramatic as his near execution had been traumatic. The state of California had issued a formal apology and awarded him a settlement of $12 million, compensation that felt both inadequate and overwhelming. More importantly, the federal investigation triggered by Max's evidence had led to the exoneration of 7 other innocent people, including 2 who had been on death row. "Morning, old friend," Tom said softly, kneeling to place the flowers beside Max's headstone. "Thought you'd like to know, little Emma Rodriguez took her first steps yesterday, Doctor. Rodriguez says she's going to be walking all over the clinic soon." Dr. Emily Rodriguez had become more than just the veterinarian who had saved Max's life long enough for the truth to emerge. She and Tom had developed a deep friendship built on shared grief and mutual respect. Her 3-year-old daughter Emma had adopted Tom as an honorary grandfather, filling some of the emptiness left by Max's absence. Tom's voice caught slightly as he continued his one-sided conversation with his departed companion. "Sarah's doing well, too. Her book about your story hit the bestseller list last week. Max's Truth is helping fund legal aid for wrongfully convicted people all across the country. You'd be proud of her, boy." Sarah Patterson had indeed channeled her investigative skills and passion for justice into a new career as an advocate for the wrongfully convicted. Her book about Max's role in exposing the corruption had not only become a national sensation, but had also established a legal defense fund that had already helped dozens of innocent people secure proper representation. The sound of approaching footsteps caused Tom to look up. Sarah herself was walking through the memorial garden, accompanied by a young woman Tom didn't recognize. The stranger looked to be in her early 30s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that reminded Tom somehow of Max. "Tom," Sarah said warmly, "I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the University of California's Animal Behavior Research Center." Dr. Walsh stepped forward with a slight smile. "Mr. Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you. I've been studying Max's case for my research on canine loyalty and memory. What he did, preserving evidence for 3 years while suffering from separation anxiety, it's unprecedented in the literature." Tom stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. "Max was special, that's for certain, but I'm not sure what more there is to study about him." "Actually," Dr. Walsh said, her voice growing excited, "that's why I'm here. We'd like to establish a research program in Max's honor, studying how dogs can assist in criminal investigations, not just through traditional canine work, but through their unique abilities to preserve evidence and detect deception." The proposal intrigued Tom more than he expected. The idea that Max's legacy could continue through scientific research that might help other innocent people appealed to his desire to find meaning in the tragedy. Sarah had more news to share. "Tom, there's something else. The City Council voted unanimously last night to rename the police headquarters the Thomas Mitchell Justice Center. They want you to attend the dedication ceremony next month." Tom felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. The building where he had once served with pride had become a symbol of corruption under Bobby's leadership. Having it bear his name felt both honoring and burdensome. "What about Bobby?" Tom asked quietly. "Any word on how he's doing?" Sarah's expression grew somber. He's been transferred to a minimum security facility outside Sacramento. His lawyers say he's cooperating fully with the federal investigation, helping to identify other corrupt networks in police departments across the state. The question of Bobby's fate remained one of the most painful aspects of Tom's new life. Despite everything, the betrayal, the near execution, Max's death, Tom found himself unable to completely abandon the love he felt for the troubled young man he had raised. Bobby was serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole in 25 years, and Tom visited him monthly, still hoping for some form of redemption. "He asks about you every time I visit," Tom admitted. "Wants to know if you're taking care of yourself, if you're happy. I think the guilt of what he did to Max haunts him more than anything else." Dr. Walsh had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "Mr. Mitchell, if I may ask, have you considered getting another dog? I don't mean as a replacement for Max, of course. Nothing could replace that bond. But companionship might help with the grief process." Tom had been avoiding this question for months. Well-meaning friends and strangers had suggested he adopt another German Shepherd, but the idea felt like a betrayal of Max's memory. However, something about Dr. Walsh's gentle manner made him consider the possibility more seriously than he had before. "I've thought about it," Tom admitted. "But it wouldn't be fair to compare any dog to Max. He wasn't just a pet. He was a partner, a friend, a hero." "I understand completely," Dr. Walsh replied, "but sometimes the best way to honor a departed companion is to give another animal the chance to experience the kind of love you shared with Max." As if summoned by their conversation, a young German Shepherd puppy came bounding through the memorial garden, trailing a broken leash and clearly having escaped from somewhere nearby. The puppy, perhaps 4 months old, ran directly to Tom and sat at his feet, looking up with bright amber eyes that were startlingly similar to Max's. "Well, hello there," Tom said, kneeling down to pet the excited puppy. "Where did you come from, little one?" A frazzled-looking woman appeared moments later, calling out, "Justice! Justice! Come back here!" Tom looked up in surprise. "Justice?" The woman, slightly out of breath, explained, "I'm sorry, he's still learning to walk on a leash properly." "Oh, I'm Maria Santos. I work at the Riverside Animal Shelter. This little guy was brought in last week, and when I heard his story, well, I thought you might like to meet him." Maria went on to explain that Justice had been found abandoned near the warehouse where Marcus Rivera had been murdered. The puppy had been malnourished and scared, but the veterinary examination revealed no serious health problems. More remarkably, he had displayed an unusual ability to comfort other distressed animals at the shelter. "It's like he understands sadness," Maria said. "The other dogs calm down when he's around. The shelter staff started calling him Justice because he seemed to bring peace to troubled souls." Tom found himself overwhelmed by the symbolism of the moment. Here, at Max's grave, a puppy named Justice had literally run into his life. Sarah and Dr. Walsh exchanged meaningful glances, both recognizing the significance of this unexpected encounter. Justice seemed perfectly content to sit beside Tom, occasionally glancing at Max's headstone as if somehow understanding its importance. His resemblance to Max was uncanny, but his personality was distinctly his own, more playful, more trusting, carrying none of the trauma that had marked Max's later years. "What do you think, Max?" Tom whispered, looking at the headstone. "Should I give this little guy a chance?" A gentle breeze stirred the wild flowers on Max's grave, and Tom took it as the answer he needed. Sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest heartbreak. Tom Mitchell's journey from death row to redemption reminds us that love transcends even the darkest betrayals, and that loyalty, like the unwavering devotion of his German Shepherd Max, can literally save lives. For those of us who've reached our golden years, we understand that true happiness isn't found in perfect circumstances, but in the courage to love unconditionally, despite life's inevitable disappointments. Tom chose to forgive Bobby, the son who betrayed him, because he recognized that love isn't conditional on worthiness. It's a choice we make every day. Max's sacrifice teaches us that sometimes the most profound acts of devotion come from the simplest souls, and that our four-legged companions often show us the kind of loyalty we struggle to find in human relationships. As Tom knelt at Max's grave and welcomed little Justice into his heart, he discovered what many of us learn too late. Healing doesn't mean forgetting the past, but having the courage to open our hearts to new possibilities. The deepest happiness comes not from avoiding pain, but from choosing love again after we've been broken. What companion, human or animal, has shown you the truest loyalty in your life? Have you ever had to choose between holding on to hurt or opening your heart to new love?